is the essence of cancel culture, right? It's trying to define the cool kids table.
Yeah.
And shut you out of it. It's a bunch of vicious mean girls.
Mm-hmm.
We have weaponized the mean girl mentality on a cultural level. And the only proper way to respond to that is to roll your eyes. Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-hosts today are Mystie Winkler and Abby Wall. Mystie is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé Sisters sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Next month, the month of May, is our annual spring training, as you well know. We are pleased to announce that our coach this year is the one and only Rosaria Butterfield, author of a number of wonderful books, including The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert and The Gospel Comes with a House Key. While registration is not yet open, now is the perfect time to go ahead and sign up for your Sophie membership. You'll get all the normal fabulous benefits of being a Sophie, and as usual, the spring training sessions are included in your membership at no extra charge. Head on over to scholesisters.com/sistership and sign up. In today's episode, Mystie, Abby, and I discuss our way through the entire thinking person's checklist at the back of Alan Jacobs' book, How to Think. This was a fun and interesting conversation to have, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
I would like to go first. This is Abby. Okay, so I get bonus points. It's a reread, and it is on my 5x5 challenge, which I've been reading things that are not on my challenge lately. So
you're like winning the book virtue awards
I really
today.
am.
No kidding.
And it is a great book. So I just wins all around. It is.
Okay, Abby, you're the best. Fine.
I am. Thank you for noticing. Thank you. And then usually my husband will follow up that comment with, and so humble. So I'm reading Jane Austen's Persuasion.
I love that one.
I do too.
Good one.
It's one of my favorites. And I was just going to have a Jane Austen category this year, but I really didn't want to reread Mansfield Park or Emma. Because I don't really like either of those. And I know people love Emma, but she just
really... People love Mansfield Park.
I know. Lady Dusk, Dawn Garrett giving you a shout out for your favorite Austen, but I have yet to find its merits. So, I mean, I'll read it, but it's not my favorite. So I also have Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, but I wanted kind of a quick win. And Persuasion is short and just witty, and it's such a great book. So I am just thoroughly enjoying that. That is my brag for this Scholé Everyday choice.
Good job. I feel like we should, I don't know, if we were in that book that I shared at the retreat a couple years ago, we could like all put gold stars all over you.
I mean, I might be acting like, what is it? The Baronet Elliot, but just being too self-important about my reading. So I will try and not be so self-important.
Okay, good. You can go sit in the humble corner while Mystie tells us what she's reading.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, my book is the bubble bath category.
Nice.
So
Abby made you feel really bad.
It's the opposite corner of Abby's.
There you go.
And it's not the sort of book that I usually read. It's kind of fun. I have a friend and we often will read a book together. We've been friends since high school. So, reading the same book is one of the ways that we stay connected over the years. And so I hopped on in January while I was filling out my 5x5 challenge, and I left a few different spots available and said, hey, is there any book that you're reading that you think we should read together? And she was just getting from the library this book called Hotel at the Corner of Bitter and Sweet.
I've never heard of it.
I had never either. I mean, it's a newer book, so newer fiction. This is like usually an automatic pass for me.
Yeah.
I was like, well, if Ellie's reading it, I'll read it. It is a novel set in the Seattle area.
Oh, interesting.
And it does fit into my historical fiction category. It is one of those books that has a flashback. So there's a main character and you're seeing him sometimes in his, I think, 50s. And then when he's 12 and 13. So it goes back and forth between those two periods in his life. And it was really well done. It's a first novel by the author, Jamie Ford. The main character is Chinese, and then he makes friends with a Japanese girl. And this is Seattle in World War II is when he's 12 and 13. And so it's about when the Japanese are evacuated and put in internment camps and what Seattle was like in the International District at that time, which wasn't the International District. It was Chinatown.
Interesting.
So you see a little bit of the changes in Seattle from the 40s to the 80s going back and forth in his life, which is still quite a bit different than the 2020s. But it's like, it was... But it's fun since that's my area of the town.
Right, yeah.
And they even drive, he goes, it's like, spoiler, he goes and drives to visit, takes the Greyhound to visit his friend in the internment camp in Idaho. So then they travel through even my part of the state in Idaho and all places that I know. So
isn't that fun?
It is kind of fun.
That was like in Lonesome Gods. I was kept looking up and just anybody, this is my place. You want to tell somebody and no one cares. But I felt like someone should know. I was reading about my own place.
Yeah, their bus stops in Walla Walla and they get out and have lunch at the Marcus Whitman Hotel. And she's like, hey, that's like 30-minute drive from my house.
So fun. I love that. I love moments like that.
It was a good book. I did finish it. And I thought that the author actually pulled it off pretty well.
Oh, good. Well, this is Brandy. And mine is, I'm probably going to butcher how to say this, but the Didascalicon.
You did it. That is the way Dr. Schleck says it. So you must be right.
I feel so
I have no idea how you say it, so it sounds good.
I'm almost as virtuous as Abby, but not quite. So the Didascalicon of Hugh of St. Victor. And I'm only in book 2 right now, but I'm having a grand old time. And I have started making diagrams.
Awesome.
So I'm having a lot of fun with it. Just because he'll do these things where he's he's organizing the way that you think about things. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Let me hold on.
Everything has 3 parts or 4 parts. 4 of these.
Yeah. I'm pulling it out because I was writing on a Starbucks napkin in my car. So I have, philosophy is divided into 4 parts: theoretical, practical, mechanical, and logical. And then he goes to theoretical and he divides that into 3 parts. So that would be theology and math and physics. And then he takes math and divides that into 4 parts. Anyway, it just keeps going and going. And so it's super fun because it gives you the sense of the structure of how he thought about things, because he's actually describing this diagram and you can actually draw it out. I felt like it's really helping me see it through his eyes a lot more than if he was saying things that were just kind of vague and harder to put on paper in a concrete way like that. And then he has these just wonderful quotable passages that are so inspiring or whatever. So, and I read the whole introduction, so I feel like I've read a lot of the book, but honestly, I was looking at this and I think I'm only about 25 pages into his actual writing because the introduction was so long. But I'm glad I read the introduction. I almost skipped it because I tend to hate introductions. But I felt like I don't really know who Hugh of St. Victor is, and I don't have a very good understanding of where he is in relationship to other thinkers. And so probably I should read the introduction so I can kind of place him.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really helpful that he was going through and he was the introduction writer person. So that would be the translator, who was Jerome Taylor. And so he goes through and he's comparing the Didascalicon to 2 other works for the most part. There's a few others, but there's 2 that he keeps coming back to. And I did not do this on purpose, but they were 2 I've actually read.
Oh.
So it was...
Have you read John of Salisbury?
Well, I was noticing that he came back to On Christian Teaching by Augustine. And then it was, what's his name? Hold on.
Boethius?
No, he did come back. I was thinking I need to read Boethius because he did come back to that a lot too. It was the Institutes of Learning. Cassiodorus. Thank you. I always want to say Coriolanus, and that is a Life of Plutarch that I was reading at the same time.
And a Shakespeare play.
And, yeah, exactly. So I was reading that at the same time I was reading Cassiodorus, and I botched his name every time. It was terrible. So anyway, but it was actually fun that as he kept comparing it to those things, I had read them, which honestly, the Augustine one I had only read because we did a podcast episode on it. So I have you guys to thank for this. I mean, I owned it and I intended to read it, but I wouldn't have read it before I read this, except that we recorded that episode before I got to this book. So it was wonderful timing. I am having a great time, and I'm really, I guess because I'm on this school board and we're founding this school, I'm finding it very challenging to think through these things through a very, very Christian lens, because he is very clear that the purpose of learning is to know Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really easy when we're talking about things like writing curriculum and deciding, how many minimum days are you going to have in a year. It's really easy to lose sight of your big goals when you're in the minutia of everything. And so I feel like it's this really good balance for me right now of, we're making all these practical decisions. And then every time I crack open the book, he's like, but the main thing, at the end of the day, no one cares about your minimum day schedule. And I mean, yes, teacher hiring practices are important, but remembering what is wisdom. His emphasis is on the idea that classical education makes one wise. He wouldn't call it classical. He'd just call it education. Education makes one wise. Christ is wisdom. And so that's how he makes his argument of, therefore, educate, like our purpose is to know Christ, because we're growing in wisdom and he is wisdom. But I love that then he includes so many things that we would call secular learning in that. Like the wisdom of the ant is still an insight into God and his character. So anyway.
Yeah, I'm reading it right now too, and I love it.
Where are you? I was going to ask you where you are in this.
I'm doing it for the class, so I had to read the whole thing in 2 weeks. So I finished it. But I could go back through and still get just as much out of it again.
Oh, I bet.
Hi, Abby here to give you an inside look into the community we call the Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to gather together and engage in meaningful and fruitful conversation. Sophie membership. It's named Sophie's because the bonuses included are focused on the pursuit of wisdom and understanding in philosophy and education. It is where you can pursue the education you wish you had and learn to pass it on. You will have access to everything that free and supporters do. Plus, you get annual swag at no extra cost. You can find mentorship on the journey of studies in Plutarch, Shakespeare, and so many more. You can expand your self-education with seminars and training. We desire to see a grassroots resurgence in the liberal arts, especially dialectic, the lost art of truth-seeking conversation. You can do this too by becoming a Sophie today. Go to scholasisters.com/sistership.
All right, so let's transition to our topical discussion. We are having our discussion today based upon the very, very back part of How to Think by Alan Jacobs. And I'm having this discussion, even though I pretty much disapprove of this book.
Well, it's probably because you're reading things like Hugh of St. Victor. And I mean, let's face it.
No, I really don't think that's why. I mentioned this and I had someone else say the same thing. I really don't think that's why. I think it's because it's called How to Think, but I didn't feel like reading it would make someone think better. And then it is also, the subtitle is A Survival Guide for a World at Odds. And I'm not sure it really helps there either. So I felt, but you know what? I was thinking about this. I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes you take a book to a publisher and they name it for you and you don't have much control. So I don't even know if it was him. I feel like the book is more prerequisites to thinking. It's not really how to think.
Or like what thinking isn't.
Right.
And why we need it.
Like it's an argument for thinking. And it's an argument of how we set ourselves up to not an argument. It tells us how we set ourselves up to not think and how we can be better about opening ourselves up to thinking. But I didn't think it actually helped me think better. So some of it was just my expectations. Like when I read The Intellectual Life,
yes,
I walked away saying, oh, if I wanted to cultivate my intellectual life, here are a whole bunch of things I could do to cultivate my intellectual life.
Mm-hmm.
This is how to think, but I feel like I need another book to tell me how to think, because this is just, if you already agree that you shouldn't just read a book on your own all the time, and so that it's good to have discussion. And if you believe that you shouldn't live in an echo chamber, then that's like the first 2/3 of the book, really boiled down. And that is just a prerequisite to being able to think, in my opinion.
But do you think, though, that people often think that they are engaging not in their echo chamber? Like they think they're more broad-minded than they actually.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Do you think that this book addresses those kinds of things?
I think it addresses the dangers of how you might think you're a thinking person and not be a thinking person. I just don't think that it makes us think better.
So what would you title this book, Brandy?
I was trying to think about that actually, because I was like, I really feel like most of my beef was that I walked in with completely different expectations. Because it's not like I didn't underline things. I'm flipping through here and I'm like, underline. Like I thought I liked what he said about certain things. So it wasn't like I had a beef with him. It was just that I think I was looking for a book where there were like some categories that I feel like there.
So the prerequisites of thinking?
I think it would be like prerequisites or how to set yourself up to become a thinking person. Not how to think, but like, that is not a good title. I'm not a catchy title person.
He is really more addressing blind spots, maybe?
Yeah.
Problem areas.
Yes.
These are the things that prevent thinking that are really easy to slip into.
Yes, for sure. And they're for real dangers. Like, I don't want to minimize what he's saying. I just felt like the book set me up to learn certain lessons that I didn't learn. And I actually really wanted to learn them. I think that's probably the other part of my frustration.
Yes.
Because I often feel like when I'm reading a book or an article or something that there is a way for me to go deeper in how I'm thinking about this thing, but I don't know what it is. I mean, it kind of reminds me of like last year during logic class, Stephen would say things about, well, if you look at this through the 4 causes, and I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the 4 causes, so I'm not able to apply that to a book.
Mm-hmm.
But those were the kinds of things I think I wanted to do. I mean, not the 4 causes, but I was hoping that it would be something that really helped me be a better thinker.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Something more like, you're not the thinker you think you are.
Yes.
That might be the title.
And that's a catchy title. See, look how good you are at this.
I don't think it'd be a title that would sell books. But
that's true. People don't like to be attacked. They want to be affirmed. We could call it, you're a good thinker, but
not.
That does not mean, though, that his thinking person's checklist at the back is a bad one, because it's a good one. So That's what we're talking about today. His thinking person's checklist. Though, again, I will say that these are more like how to set yourself up so that you will be disposed to thinking than it is, here's how to make sure you really thought about something. Anyway, I just thought we could go through it and talk about the list, things on the list, debate the things on the list, but also I would love to hear if you guys think there's something obvious that's missing. I'm not saying that I've identified that. I'm just saying, is there anything you would add to a list like this? So be thinking about that too as we go on. So.
Sounds good.
All right. So do you want to just start off with number 1, or does anybody have something to say first?
Well, I think he does make in his conclusion, so the thinking person's checklist is his afterword. And his conclusion is actually that thinking is an art. What checklists do, he's going from Gawande, I don't know how to say that, the surgeon who wrote the Checklist Manifesto, I think is the name of the book.
Oh, yes.
So Atul Gawande.
I think that's right. It looks right.
Okay, so he and I just highlighted this part, but people make such checklists for themselves only when forced by experience into intellectual humility. Proud people don't want to use them, but once those same proud people are forced to use them, they acquire a dose of that very humility because they have no choice but to acknowledge that they forget things that they need to remember. I thought that was important because he does talk about how this doesn't mean that the rest of his book, he's like trying to put it away with a simple checklist. He obviously knows that there's more than this. And he said, please add or subtract to ones that, he does talk about that. Alan Jacobs does. But I think that humility is a big part of that, like overall, because it is hard work. And if we think we know things, then there's not a lot of humility in those things. So anyway, the humility piece was kind of the overarching idea of this checklist is this is just to help you remain humble.
I'm glad you brought that up because it definitely is a prerequisite to the list and it's not on the list. It's not like number 1 is, so be humble. He's assuming that you already read that, but you're right. Because anytime we're trying to learn or think through something, if we assume we already know and have nothing to learn, then the process has already ended.
Yes.
All right. Are you ready for number 1?
Yep.
Ready.
Number 1, when faced with provocation to respond to what someone has said, give it 5 minutes. And I'm not going to read the whole rest of the thing because it gets longer, but
I liked that one.
Yep.
That goes for disciplining kids too.
I was just going to say.
It's just a rule of life.
Yeah, it's true.
That is provocation as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've realized I have one child that always wants a quick response from me for just about any request.
Yeah, I have one of those too.
I finally said today, I've decided if you want a quick response, the answer is no.
Yeah.
If you would like the possibility at a yes, you're going to have to wait longer. And I don't even think 5 minutes was my target. I think 30 seconds was my target because there was this insistence that it should just be like no time lost, immediate answer. So give it 5 minutes. Wisdom takes time. Number 2, value learning over debating. Don't talk for victory. What do you think?
Yeah.
I have seen the need for this one a lot in the last year. I think, do we care how the other person has come to the conclusions they have come to? Even if we disagree with their conclusions, we would understand all of the issues at play better if we could listen to how they arrived at their conclusions instead of just feeling like the conversation has to be about who is right and who is wrong. And we're trying to establish agreement by one person admitting the other person is correct.
Sometimes there's more overlap if we hear the whole thing too. I'm thinking specifically of a very liberal friend I have, and she and I come to very opposite conclusions, but it's interesting to me how if you take it backwards, 5 or 6 steps, we actually agree on that. What we're disagreeing on is how you get there.
Yeah. Even if you don't end up agreeing on how to get there, you can have a conversation knowing that you do care about the same things instead of assuming the worst about others, which comes back to that humility piece.
So true. Number 3, as best you can, online and off, avoid the people who fan flames.
I live with someone who likes to fan flames.
Yeah, that was my only, I think if I were rewriting these or making my own version, this one would be more about controlling your own like recognizing someone who fans flames and controlling your own responses. But this comes a little bit too close to the like cut toxic people from your life.
Yeah,
type
I
of
had the
advice,
same response.
Which he's trying to do it succinctly. And I,
Well, and he talks about how he's been on Twitter.
yes.
So, I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of us could just avoid Twitter and problem solve.
Totally. If they aren't people that you need to, if you're going looking for trouble, then you're going to find it. And if you are debating things on Twitter, then you're debating things with people who are fanning flames for fun.
Yes.
Right. It's true.
And can you really debate something in 140 characters?
Well, yeah, that's true.
I mean, or whatever it is. I may not even have that correctly because I don't have Twitter.
I mean, I will not say that I've never fanned flames just for fun. But I meant it in a funny way and not in a wanting people to hate each other sort of way. I get in trouble for this at home sometimes. I'm like, sorry, I got bored.
I'm related to people like you.
I'll just apologize now for my whole kind. But the idea of avoiding people, on the one hand, we have, biblical commands about what to do with someone who is divisive, like, for example, in the church.
Yes.
So I think he has grounds for saying something like that. But the danger is that I have had times where someone interpreted me as fanning flames just because I dared to question in a very peaceful sounding voice their conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Really, it was that anyone who disagreed with them was interpreted as fanning flames. So if we're not careful, avoiding people who fan flames can actually be interpreted as enter echo chamber now.
Right. Because my response is going to be to flame. If anyone disagrees with me, then anyone who
Right.
disagrees with me is fanning that flame. But the problem is your own reaction in that case, and not that someone's just being a troll.
Yeah.
Yes.
I probably a good question to ask ourselves, I think it related to this, is can I make it peacefully through my life if this person never agrees with me?
Mm.
And if the answer is no, then the problem's with me. I mean, yes, when I think someone is seriously wrong, especially if I think it's doing damage, in their life and their relationships or whatever, it's very grievous. But if I'm becoming obsessed with that, then I've become that guy that's like, I can't go to bed because someone's wrong on the internet, like, am I really okay coexisting with people who think differently than me? Number 4.
Yeah.
Okay. Remember that you don't have to respond to what everyone else is responding to in order to signal your virtue and right-mindedness.
And this was written in
Before this summer?
2019. Yeah.
2019.
Like, this was written before.
Like he's a
Before
prophet.
that event, which shall not be named.
Yes.
And that could go either way, too.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's when something happens, do you have to hop on and let people know? You signaling to whichever group you're trying to appeal to.
Right. Yeah.
It plays both ways.
Yeah. Before I got off of a social media platform, I had to just start unfollowing people on both sides.
Mhm.
Because it was just absolutely incredibly, it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible on both sides.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like I couldn't get away from it. Both sides. Just stop. Just stop.
Yeah. One of the things that bothered me about so many things that happened in 2020 was actually a bit of a conflict between number 4 and number 1. Or I shouldn't say conflict, but so what he says in number 4 that we just read, you don't have to respond to what everyone else is responding to. And number 1 is when faced with provocation, give it 5 minutes. And what seemed to be happening on the internet was not only do you have to respond, but you have to respond right away. Don't take time to use your brain at all.
Yeah, because silence is what was that phrase that was going around?
Silence is consent.
Yes. Silent is consent. I didn't say it much, so, obviously I'm not, but we
Right.
probably should cut that out.
Well, no, but here, let's apply it somewhere else.
Okay.
That I have seen people who are really, really into pro-life causes
Yes.
think that if you're not spending all day long on the internet making statements about abortion, you just don't care about abortion.
Mhm.
So silence is consent has pre-existed before the summer, because that is something that I've heard for years now. And to me, as a Christian, I think of this as, yes, I am pro-life, and I think that I am obligated to be pro-life as a Christian. But with that said, I don't think that everyone is required to have a ministry that is specific to abortion. And it's confusing what God has called me to as being the job that everyone should have.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. So there's all sorts of issues on the internet that we don't get bogged down in. You know, you might care about the politics in Australia, but as an American, you're not going to post about it, right?
Yeah. And that leads to number 5.
Yep.
If you do have to respond to what everyone else is responding to in order to signal your virtue and right-mindedness, or else lose your status in your community, then you should realize it's not a community, but rather an inner ring.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we need to define the inner ring thing, because that's something he talks about in the book.
Yeah.
So that's the essay by C.S. Lewis that talks about the inner ring.
I believe that's what he's referring to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is kind of exemplified in That Hideous Strength.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone want to briefly define an inner ring?
It's in Attractions.
Okay.
What page is that?
Starts at the bottom of 55.
All right, go ahead. Tell us what it is.
Lewis, in this essay called The Inner Ring, called his audience's attention to the presence in schools and businesses and governments and armies, and indeed every other human institution, of a second or unwritten system that stands parallel to the formal organization, an inner ring. The pastor is not always the most influential person in a church, nor the boss in the workplace. Sometimes groups of people with no formal titles or authority are the ones who determine how the organization works. They form its inner ring. So it's like the manipulators in the background.
Right.
People working outside or underneath the formal structure, the formal systems, and influencing what actually happens.
There's a quote that goes on there, and this is still Lewis, where he says, "I believe that in all men's lives at certain periods, and in many men's lives at all periods, between infancy and extreme old age, one of the most dominant elements is the desire to be inside the local ring and the terror of being left outside." I really think that I was going to say hold your own, but actually I think it's to maintain your own integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And not, by the way, like, I don't think this is just an internet thing, because things can get ugly in local politics. Like, you could have a completely offline life and still get sucked into this. Because we have to remember, Lewis was writing this before there was an internet.
Right.
So to maintain your own integrity, I really think there's one key thing, and that's that you have to care more about what God thinks than what a man thinks.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't be living to please mankind. The second you start doing that, you're going to compromise in some way. It just is a matter of time.
The desire to be approved of
Mm-hmm.
by the people who have the power and influence in whichever little group you care about, or to become one of those people.
It's basically public high school, right? Like,
or middle school.
It's probably, actually, yes, that is true. That is true.
It's worse in middle school, I think.
It's this whole idea that the most valuable thing that could happen to you is to sit at the cool kids table.
Right. Exactly.
So don't do that.
So if you do have to respond to signal your virtue and right-mindedness, or lose your status, that it's not a community, it's just the cool kids table.
Right. And that is the essence of cancel culture, right? It's trying to define the cool kids table.
Yeah.
And shut you out of it. It's a bunch of vicious, mean girls.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not all girls, but I'm just saying, like, to use a cultural metaphor, we have weaponized the mean girl mentality on a cultural level. And the only proper way to respond to that is to roll your eyes.
Yes.
So, number 6, gravitate as best you can in every way you can toward people who seem to value genuine community and can handle disagreement with equanimity. Was that the right way to say that word?
Nope.
Equanimity.
Equanimity. Good. Thank you.
I love when my kids read out loud a word that they have totally right and it's almost right, but we're like, no, that's not how it's said.
It wasn't until right the second that I realized I've never heard anyone say that word out loud.
So, you weren't even home. That's usually your typical homeschooler problem.
But see, I don't do audiobooks.
Yeah. So audiobooks do help.
I have stunted growth.
Except when they're mostly written or read by people with British accents. Then on some words, it doesn't help.
That's right. I would be saying advertisement.
Yes.
I like just saying aluminium and vitamins. So I just sometimes say those things to my kids.
Well, if I was going to rewrite number 6, I would say join the sistership.
That's what I think he meant.
That's definitely what he meant. So there is such a thing as orthodoxy, especially within the church, right? But how does the community that you belong to handle disagreement on secondary issues? Like, yes, it matters within the church whether you hold to certain doctrines and basic confessions, but how is it handled between homeschoolers, private schoolers, public schoolers, or vaccinating, not vaccinating, or there's like a zillion things that cause mommy wars. But I think that can kind of key into kind of when you're trying to evaluate your own community and whether or not it's genuine. How are people treated when it's a decision that's a wisdom call and they make a different decision than those in charge or just the cool kids? Because Lewis makes the point that sometimes those in charge aren't the cool kids that are enforcing the rules. So maybe a clue there for us is when we're taking secondary things and making them primary. One of the purposes we say for classical education is that it's ordering our loves.
Yes.
One way to think of ordering our loves is really that it's helping us see what is supposed to have top priority and then helping us deprioritize things that feel really important to us, but actually it's just a form of idolatry. Okay, number 7. Seek out the best and fairest minded of people whose views you disagree with. Listen to them for a time without responding. Whatever they say, think it over.
I think we should all try that, honestly.
Yep.
Yes.
I have often thought that one of the beauties of narration, especially the order that Charlotte Mason encourages us to do it in, which I think is based on historical precedent, but the idea that you read and then you narrate, and that any discussion or opinion on what you just read comes after you have correctly articulated what the author said and meant. It helps train us to have, what does he say here? A fair mind. I was thinking a just mind, but I think those are basically the same things. Forcing myself to recreate the argument of an author that I might have a big disagreement with or just have some quibbles with, but forcing before I tear apart the book, How to Think, that I need to narrate those chapters and think about what he said. I just think it's a really good discipline. In fact, I think I told, where was it? Was it at it was our 5x5 meetup early in the year that I talked about how when I went through our book assessment wheel and all that stuff, I actually had to give How to Think a higher level of stars. Or a higher level. I'm sorry, it's not stars, it's hearts. Yes. But anyway, I had to give it a higher rating because when I forced myself to think through it and evaluate it that way, my personal disappointment isn't actually how I should assess the whole book.
Right. On handling disagreements in your community, and my example that I thought of was, whether or not you can have a conversation with someone who likes Christmas Carol.
I'm offended and I'm going to take my ball and go home. No. It's all right. In heaven, you'll find out how wrong you are. Really, I really think that what's lacking from our culture is this realization that we don't have to bring about all justice all the time. That there is a final reckoning in which, among other things, Mystie will find out how great Charles Dickens was. So
we'll just see.
I think 7 and 8 specifically, and I know we haven't read 8 yet, but it just made me think of 1 Corinthians 13, right? That whole passage on love and how prophecies, they'll pass away, tongues, they'll cease, knowledge, it will pass away because we know in part and we prophesy in part. And then we see through a mirror dimly. Like we don't get everything anyway, but eventually it will be. But I'm just thinking about how faith, hope, and love, right? Or charity. And I think that is a big thing that perhaps isn't in his list is charity, loving my neighbor. And he says it in differently, but I would say that 7 is, best and fair-minded people and listen to them with charity. And then in 8, it says, patiently and honestly as you can, assess your repugnances.
It's a great word.
And I loved that. But it really did remind me of how we are to love and what it is that we can patiently, right? The long suffering in certain translations and not being rude or boastful or arrogant. And it's very hard to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it requires that humility and the charity to set aside that feeling like you have to correct everyone and just listen to someone whose conclusions you disagree with in order to understand their thought process, their reasoning, to understand the issue better. That's really dialectic conversation. It is dialectic happens when you're talking to someone with whom you disagree, because in trying to hear how the other person comes to the conclusions that they do, it makes you look at the situation or the circumstances, the reasoning in a different way, and helps both of you refine your thinking and your understanding. Even if you still don't end up agreeing, you can profit from it.
Yeah. We're definitely thinking deeper, and we're generally better informed on the issues where someone has pushed back on us. If we're just surrounded by everybody who agrees with us, there are always flaws in our thinking. Even if we're right, there are flaws in our logic of how we got there or how we're supporting our arguments or whatever. And it's only in encountering someone who will push back on you that you have to refine your thoughts. Number 9. I actually feel like I need help wrapping my mind around this one a little bit. It's sometimes the ick factor is telling. Sometimes it's a distraction from what matters. What does he really mean? I don't know why I had a hard time with this one.
Where did he talk about that?
Well, that's what I was thinking, is it might just have been that now it's long enough since I finished the book that part didn't stick out to me and I have forgotten.
Perhaps it was the white supremacy group. He built up a rapport with the girl before he told her who he was. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't white supremacy group. Maybe it was something else. I can't remember.
So I'm thinking what he means here is that you can have something that you really disapprove of, and it's going to be different for different people. And it might be moral issues, or it might be like personal pet peeve type issues. But let's use something really, really neutral. Let's just take the example of a person who has terrible body odor. And let's say they live next door to you. Okay. And that's the ick factor. Okay. Well, sometimes it's telling. So when would it be telling? I'm thinking like it would be telling you that they're going to be terrible neighbors because of XYZ and all these, like maybe the whole house is unclean and you've got basically some sort of weird episode of HGTV about to happen next door to you. But it could just be that that person has bad personal care habits and is actually a very pleasant neighbor. And you could learn a lot from them on some other level. The reason why this came to mind is because I had a friend that was telling me that she just had this old man in her family who just refused to wear deodorant because that wasn't something his generation did, the end. And this person was worth knowing and spending time with. But the ick factor really could have put up a barrier between the relationship of the next generation to this person. That's a really neutral example to tell us that, like, sometimes something like bad body odor is going to be indicative of a whole set of problems that you'd probably rather avoid and not get sucked into, or even possibly dangerous, morally, physical safety, whatever. On the other hand, it might just be a distraction and you're missing a chance to get to know another human and learn from them.
Hey, that you I found he doesn't use ick factor, but his example is very similar to that.
Oh, really? Okay. Maybe I actually plagiarized and didn't realize.
So he's talking about the whole system 1, system 2 of your brain, that your conscious thought versus your unconscious thought. And so the fear system, we have those responses, and they're actually very important to protect us. He's using other people's terminology here. System 1, or the elephant, is the response, the fight or flight response system. He says, if some creepy looking dude who appears to have not bathed or washed his clothes in a year calls to us, system 1 has all the fear alarms primed. We don't have to stop and think. So that's a good thing.
Mystie, it's like when we got lost in Portland and we tried to get to Powell's and we got off on the wrong bus stop.
Yes.
On Burnside. And that was super exciting.
All my systems said these are not people to stop and chat with.
Yep.
Don't make eye contact.
It's like taking a wrong turn in Skid Row. Don't do it.
But to also recognize that those initial impressions aren't infallible. And so to even be able to step back and examine what those responses are and why you had them, and whether or not in this particular situation that's reasonable.
All right, number 10. We're going to do it. We're going to make it through the whole list. I'm determined.
We are.
Excellent.
Beware of metaphors and myths that do too much heavy cognitive lifting. Notice what your terministic screens are directing your attention to and what they're directing your attention away from. Look closely for hidden metaphors and beware the power of myth.
And I did go back and look over this one, and the terministic screens, he is using an essay by Kenneth Burke, and it's a particular vocabulary. So working hard to understand how terms work. What does this language ask me to see? What does it prevent me from seeing? Who benefits from my attention being directed in this way rather than that? What they do is they both bind and blind us. That's what terministic screens are.
Can anyone think of an example of a myth or a metaphor that does too much heavy cognitive lifting?
I was wondering, do you really want? Do you want my pet?
Go in bonuses?
Do you want my pet peeve version?
I've got some buzzwords that I really hate.
Do it.
And I've got a whole list.
Do it, because we only have 2 left, so we'll still have time.
The word synergy and the overuse of the word passion. Those are 2 of my pet peeve words.
Well, I mean, we're talking about ones here that
I
like tell the
narrative,
tell the story for you in a shorthand. And so, I mean, one, I think that the whole Black Lives Matter as a phrase, even as far as the storytelling, that we say this one thing means this other thing, when it doesn't necessarily in every instance. So I think you see this all the time currently with the mask issue. You have the people who say masks mean you care about other people. Masks mean loving others, loving your neighbor. So when they see people wearing masks, that's what they see. They see someone not wearing a mask. They see someone who only cares about themselves. Then you got the other extreme, and they see, if you wear a mask, you're just a sheeple who will do whatever the government says, and you don't think for yourself. So and it's like, or those are not the only 2 options.
Right.
But there are a lot of people in both of those opposite extremes who are living out a lot of their other issues in life through that one particular story. And everything else is going around whichever extreme they've picked up on.
That's a really good example.
I just love how we're just, super non-confrontational or controversial in this episode. I really appreciate that.
Hopefully by the time it airs, it won't be so controversial.
Just
hoping.
Wait a sec. When is that?
I know.
think
2023.
But if they're listening to this podcast, then they're going to be understanding that they don't have to respond to it. They can wait.
Right. It's just
And if this is your ick factor, don't let it distract you from what matters.
Yeah.
So
Just know that we have love and charity and humility.
I mean, really, the reason why I said it was a good example wasn't just because I completely agree with you, but I do agree with you, but it was because I was trying to think of a metaphor that did too much heavy cognitive lifting, like told the whole story that you're not allowed to question.
right.
And I couldn't think of one that did that. So that was really good.
Right.
All right. Number 11, try to describe others' positions in the language that they use without indulging in other wordsing.
This is probably the one I have the hardest time with. I love in other wordsing. My husband calls me on it all the time.
Well, okay. I did have a question about this. Like, I could see what he's saying. If you're reading a book, you don't have a chance to discuss with the author. So you should, to do justice, you should try to put it in their language. But I'm thinking about how sometimes paraphrasing is part of the comprehension gymnastics that we need to do. If I'm in a heated discussion with my husband and I say, in other words, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, actually, that interchange is actually super helpful. He said
that's true.
I heard this.
Well, you're paraphrasing. So I think, and that's why I think he used this as a phrase, a hyphenated phrase, because he talks about it in the book.
Right.
And I relate because this is something that I tend to do. Let me boil this down and tell you what you're really saying. And I give my interpretation of what the kernel is, which might not actually be what they intended to say. Even if you're paraphrasing and using other words, you should express the other person's position in a way that they would concur. Yes, that's my position.
So basically, we're getting back to justice.
Well, we're getting back to marriage counseling. That was one of the things that
which
they
I
talked
obviously need after what the example that I gave.
No, that's what it is. It's like when you are talking, you don't say you statements, right? Well, you said this and this and this. It's, well, this is what I heard. And then you try to phrase it in a manner that, like you said, Misty, that is what they accept. Yes, or well, yes, but this is what I meant by that, right? Like it's a clarifying exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually showing you actively listening to them.
Right. Versus, in other words, you just don't like me at all isn't helpful.
I don't think Misty would say that. In fact, I know she would not say that. She would say,
no, it'd be more like,
let me just tell you how you're wrong, and I'll give you a succinct bullet points, and you won't have an inch to talk. She got to.
Was there a slide deck accompanying her?
it'd be more like, Brandy likes the Christmas Carol. In other words, she doesn't think that Christ belongs in Christmas.
Oh, ow.
That's not true.
She's okay with stories that don't tell the gospel about Christmas.
Well, but isn't that interesting? Actually, what's interesting to me is that it's a very immature way to think. I remember my kids, so we
There you go, Misty.
No, because I know you were kidding and you weren't actually accusing me of that. But like, I remember that when our kids were little and they were growing up, we didn't do Halloween. And a big reason for that just had to do with some really negative experiences I had growing up with this particular holiday. So we just didn't do it. So I didn't care. And so we didn't do it. And then one day we're walking in our neighborhood and we had some missionaries who had come home off field, bought a house in our neighborhood, and their house was like all decked out for Halloween because, and I knew this as the parent, they viewed Halloween as a really great outreach opportunity where they're going to get all the kids in the neighborhood to come to their house, and so that was their angle on it. And, my kids are walking by this house that's all decked out for Halloween and they're like, I thought they were Christians. And I'm like, oh no. Somehow we personally don't celebrate Halloween had become in their minds. If you celebrate Halloween, you're obviously not a Christian. So I had to unteach a lot of things, but it's funny how we can incorporate our assumptions about other people into some of these assessments if we're not careful. Maybe that's what he's getting at. we're trying to make sure we understand rather than jumping to our conclusions of and assumptions that we're making. I mean, it was a great mental process for my little kids to sit them down and say, well, can you see how they see this as an opportunity to bring, neighborhood children to their house and maybe even get a chance to talk to them about Jesus, and it was like, they couldn't fathom that. So getting to sit down and think through, like, here's a family that's doing something very differently than us, and it has perfectly wonderful motivations.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other common problem that number 11 here is addressing is setting up a straw man.
Right.
I'm going to express the other person's position in such a way that it's easy for me to take it down.
Right.
And I think the opposite example of that is the way Aquinas lays out his refutation model. When he starts off expressing what in the end he's going to refute, if you read his presentation of the error, it almost sounds like he's convincing you.
Yeah.
It's a very well done understanding of what someone who believes that, how they would actually express it.
Yeah. More than one time, I accidentally believed the error in reading this.
Right. You're reading it like, oh, okay.
Sounds really good. Until he tells you why you're wrong.
Well, and that essentially is what rhetoric is.
It's what dialectic is.
Dialectic, yeah. but the idea of the part of that dialectic and I thought that was part of the rhetoric too, though, because you are taking the other opinions, the other side, and going through it and then refuting it. But you're going through it in a way that isn't just completely deconstructive. It's going through those ideas and going through them, not systematically, but going through them and making points and basically conceding parts of that too, right? And then having the arguments.
Yeah. Making concessions is a part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay, number 12.
Be brave.
Be brave. Anybody want to expand? Because it's only 2 words.
Well, it's not to let fear drive, anything. In order to think, you have to be brave. And I think we have to be confident that truth will out. I think sometimes we feel maybe like truth is fragile, or that it's our job to protect it from breaking. But that's not the way it works.
That would be one fear. Another fear I thought of in reading this, it draws us back to some of the things earlier in the list, but I like the fear of other people's responses.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder also if there's another fear. It's the fear of what is required of you if you find out you're wrong.
Oh,
like the personal change level of things. You read a book and you realize you need to repent, and that's a lot of work sometimes, depending on what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot easier to just not raise any hard questions, because if we're wrong, then all sorts of things can fall apart.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, I don't know who put these verses at the bottom, but I thought whoever did that should kind of sum us up with that, because I thought they were very appropriate for this discussion.
That was me.
Yep.
All right.
Good job.
So why don't you finish us up with that, huh?
Well, when I was reviewing the list, I thought, what a lot of these boil down to is basically James 1:19. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And then also Proverbs 18:17, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him.
That's the perfect framework for the wait 5 minutes.
Yes.
Right. So
we could have proof text this list to death if we'd wanted to. Well, that was fun.
I'm glad you thought through the book and gave it an honest chance there, Brandy.
Yeah. Way to be brave.
Yeah, I had to repent, but thankfully it wasn't on the list of hard repentances. Well, thank you both for coming. This was wonderful.
Yeah. good conversation.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolesisters.com/SS87 to check it out. Don't forget to become a Sophie level member of Sistership. You will get our spring training sessions with Rosaria Butterfield in May, along with access to all of the other wonderful things going on right now, such as the Charlotte Mason tutorial with Karen Glass, multiple book clubs, and more. Sign up at scolesisters.com/sistership. Our next episode is more practical than usual. I know, you're surprised, right? In it, Pam, Mystie, Abby, and I discuss why we would transition children to independent work and how to go about it. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters. I'm not going to gripe about my kitchen. So we can just start. Sneezes. It's probably the mold growing in my kitchen from my giant flood. Anyway, I said I wasn't going to grumble. Brandy. I'm not grumbling. Okay. Sorry, I hit my microphone and it spun around in a circle. Anyway. Goodness, I must have a screw loose again. Did we have that in a previous episode where I was screw loose?
Brandy, I think that yes, that is true.
I feel like
metaphorically, physically, yeah, definitely.
It's hard to say if it's metaphorical at this point.
I was going to look it up earlier and I forgot. Actually, I didn't forget. I went and worked out. It was great.